British Army Sergeant Norman Midgley must have thought he had seen it all by April 1945. Even before the war started, he had seen his fair share of both the best and worst of humanity in his vocation as a staff photographer for the Daily Express newspaper, based in Manchester, England. When the war started, the British Army therefore had a specific task for him in mind, given his experience and expertise, specifically as a member of the Army Film and Photography Unit. It was his job to record in pictures the events experienced by British and Commonwealth forces in the fight against the Axis, he and his compatriots being embedded inside frontline British combat units. It was a role no less dangerous than any other soldier on the battlefield, and in fact statistically it was even more so, with Midgley's unit alone suffering an appalling 1 in 4 casualty rate. By the time he found himself travelling in a jeep to a remote location being held by the British 11th Armoured Division in northern Germany, southwest of the town of Bergen, on April 18, 1945, much of the fighting had begun to die down, and instead he found himself with a new task: recording the evidence of Nazi crimes. In that regard, he was told he was being taken to something particularly ghastly and inhumane: the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Originally used to house Soviet prisoners of war following Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in mid-1941, the camp later expanded to house any of the so-called undesirable people in the eugenically motivated Nazi mindset. Overcrowding, lack of food, and poor sanitation led to outbreaks of typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and dysentery among those imprisoned there. That was one thing, but as Midgley would soon discover, the only thing worse than death through negligence of those entrusted to hold them prisoner was the deliberate brutality and violence of their guards. Photographing the scenes of horror, he was then led to one of the Germans that had been taken prisoner by the British troops. This was Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer, the former commandant of the camp. In a letter written shortly after this meeting, Midgley described the man who had overseen such organized suffering, quote, "When our troops arrived at the camp, he met them resplendent in his uniform, full of arrogance. The commandant looked like a real thug. His feet were shackled to prevent his escape. He will surely be tried as a war criminal." End quote. And tried he was, for Midgley at that time could have only had a fleeting idea of the career of the man who history would remember as the Beast of Belsen. In this episode, we will shed light on the history and crimes of Kramer and the subordinates under his command. Welcome to Wars of the World. The man who had come to be remembered as the Beast of Belsen came from a relatively unassuming background. Born on November 10, 1906 in Munich, he was the only child of Theodor and Maria Kramer, a middle-class family which devoutly followed the Roman Catholic faith. When he was 9 years old, his family relocated to Augsburg, where the young Josef would attend school before beginning an apprenticeship at age 14 to become an electrician, a lucrative career at the time. Yet despite this, Kramer found himself largely unemployed for much of the 1920s, save for his brief stints as an accountant and working in a department store. By 1931, Kramer found himself pulled in by the allure of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi movement, and he quickly signed up to become a member of the party. The following year, he went a step further and joined the SS, who, as well as providing protection to the party leader, was soon growing in importance as the epitome of the Nazi ideology. In 1934, he was reassigned to a new but growing arm of the SS, which would be responsible for the confinement of those opposed to Hitler's rule following his appointment as German Chancellor in 1933. Once accepted into his new position, he was assigned to Dachau, a place whose name would come to represent the foundation of what history would remember as the concentration camps. Established on March 10, 1933, just 5 weeks after Hitler came to power, Dachau served as the prototype for the camps that were to follow. and Kramer would prove more than enthusiastic in carrying out his duties, something that impressed his senior commanders. As such, the mid-1930s would see him progress through the ranks in something of a meteoric rise to power within the service, and he soon became associated with some of the more influential members of the SS. Following the capture of Poland in 1939, Hitler ordered those Polish leaders, intellectuals, and of course, the undesirables such as Jews, to be quarantined from the rest of the population. Therefore, it was decided to establish a concentration camp to house them in the newly annexed Polish regions of Upper Silesia, and the task of locating a suitable location fell to SS officer Rudolf Hoss, who took with him an assistant, Josef Kramer. Together, the two men and their entourage scoured the region before settling on a former Polish army barracks that had been built during the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Its Polish name was Oswiecim. Its given German name was Auschwitz. Kramer, however, would find himself assigned to another significant camp as construction of Auschwitz got underway. The Natzweiler Struthof camp held the distinction of being the only concentration camp established within the confines of pre-war France's boundaries, and was established on May 1, 1941, near Natzweiler in the Brucher Valley. The area was ideal, being isolated from the main French population by dense forestry, and was situated near a quarry where prisoners could be forced to work. Kramer was named as commandant in April 1941 and oversaw its operation primarily as a labor and transit camp, and initially was focused on housing members of what Hitler referred to as the Nacht und Nebel, or night and fog groups, essentially anyone who actively opposed German rule and ideology in the occupied land, or simply those who didn't fit into the ideal image of the Nazi world. Eventually, of course, that role began to expand, and soon it became policy to simply work prisoners there to death, rather than to ship them out to dedicated extermination camps. A gas chamber was established at the camp, but this was used for selective killing of those too ill or injured to continue their work, rather than the mass extermination of Jews and others. It was while Kramer was based there that anatomist August Hirth approached Kramer with a proposal. Working towards proving the superiority of the pure Germanic peoples over the lesser peoples such as the Jews, Hirth proposed creating a collection of 87 Jewish skulls to, in his twisted mind at least, prove the inferiority of Jews by the shape of their skulls alone. Kramer was more than happy to oblige, and 87 men and women were selected to become part of the horrific display, with a documentary film crew assembled to record the whole process. Many of the selectees were transported into the camp specifically for the cruel project. In the end, 86 were gassed under Kramer's orders, while the 87th had to be shot as he fought his guards so vigorously against being gassed that they were left with no choice. His commitment to what became known as the final solution saw Kramer promoted to the rank of Hauptsturmführer, or captain in the SS, and in May 1944 he was transferred to Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the main extermination facility in the now sprawling complex of confinement and misery that he had helped to establish. Being in command of Birkenau, Kramer was said to relish in his role as Lagerführer, or camp commander in charge of operations. Those operations, of course, being the industrial-scale murder of anyone who did not fit into Nazi ideology's criteria for being truly human. Survivors and staff at the camp later testified how Kramer took an active part in the selection process of those who would be sent to work and those who would be immediately gassed. New arrivals would be forced to line up, and he would make the most rudimentary of inspections before deciding who lived and who died. Compassion was non-existent in Kramer's world, and he demanded such ruthlessness from his subordinates when dealing with people considered less than human. Dr. Franz Lucas testified that he tried to get out of assignments given to him by Kramer by faking stomach and intestinal disorders. The ruse failed to work on the camp commander, who took Lucas aside one day after he tried to get out of processing a group of Hungarian prisoners, and warned him, quote, "I know you are being investigated for favoring prisoners. I am now ordering you to go to the ramp, and if you fail to obey an order, I shall have you arrested on the spot." End quote. Discipline and disobedience from his staff and those in his custody was strictly enforced, As he would later testify himself, corporal punishment was always an option, and he had a particularly cruel way of administering it to not only add shame to the victim, but to further dissuade others. In his own twisted words, he said, quote, "I should say that I got permission to carry out corporal punishment about 35 to 40 times. The prisoner had to bend over a table and the punishment was administered by the other prisoners." End quote. However, when dealing with people who had nothing to lose, sometimes not even Kramer's harsh discipline was enough to contain the innate wish to live, such as what happened on October 7th, 1944. Kramer again recounted, quote, "There was a sort of revolt, and people tried to escape and set fire to crematoria numbers 1 and 3. At the time I was at home, about 3 kilometers away, and could not believe that it was true. I heard that all the troops available in Auschwitz No. 1 had been loaded into trucks and driven to Birkenau, and that the fire brigade was also on its way. When I arrived near crematorium No. 3, I saw that it was burnt out already. As far as I know, none of the prisoners succeeded in getting out, but by the time I had arrived, the ringleaders of the mutiny had been shot and were laying on the ground." End quote. During his time at the camp, he was joined by another notorious figure in the story of the concentration camps, that of Irma Gräser. Gräser was every bit as sadistic as Kramer, perhaps even more so, her young girl-like features standing in stark contrast to the reports of her cruelty that involved the physical, psychological, and even sexual torture of some 30,000 women prisoners under her control. Like Kramer, she took an active part in the selection process of those destined for gassing. All of this from someone who was barely 20 years old in 1944 when Kramer arrived. Kramer's time at Auschwitz II-Birkenau was comparatively short, given his time at Natzweiler Struthof. In late November 1944, he was informed that he would be transferring to the Bergen-Belsen camp, whereupon he would replace Adolf Haas as the commandant. Belsen was a different experience than his previous commands, and in fact would not even be designated as a concentration camp by the SS Economic Administration Main Office until after he replaced Haas. Located in Lower Saxony in northern Germany, the foundations of the camp were established in the autumn of 1940, being built to serve as a holding area for the expected numbers of prisoners of war, which Hitler expected to take following the start of his invasion of the Soviet Union. It would not be until July 7th, 1943, that the first transport of Jewish prisoners from Poland would arrive in the Sonderlager, or so-called special camp. These were joined in August 1943 by Jews from countries neutral in the war, but still found themselves within the Nazi hemisphere. Dubbed the Neutralenlager, or neutral camp, prisoners here came from countries such as Spain, Portugal and Turkey, and some coming from as far afield as Argentina. By October 1943, prisoners were being selected for transfer to Auschwitz, where their final fate would await them. It became so intertwined in the industrial murder machine of the Third Reich that by February 1944, the camp no longer housed non-Jewish prisoners of war, it being dedicated solely to the destruction of the Jewish people. According to American war correspondent William Fry, who entered Belsen soon after its capture and interviewed former prisoners there, quote, "At Belsen, Kramer's predecessor, also of the SS, was kind and considerate. Prisoners had enough to eat and proper medical care and were treated as human beings. The violence began with Kramer's arrival 5 months ago. He instituted starvation as punishment, kept it up as a habit. He enjoyed the shuddering filthiness with a lascivious lust for degradation and death that Belsen became. I heard that occasionally men starving in Belsen watched the dying with hunger, and as soon as they were dead, cut out their hearts, livers and kidneys and devoured them to sustain their own vanishing lives. One man seized in cannibalism by the SS was forced to kneel publicly, holding in his teeth the ear of a corpse the entire day." End quote. Just how kind and considerate Haas had been before Kramer's arrival is open to interpretation. He simply may not have had the evil glee that Kramer had in his work. Figures on deaths before and after Kramer assumed command of the camp on December 2nd, 1944 certainly imply that despite not having any gas chambers to use, he was able to bring death and misery upon the camp's population regardless, which was in the process of swelling due to an influx of prisoners from other camps, which were being closed down as the war drew ever closer to Germany. In the first month of his tenure, 360 people died at Belsen. That number almost quadrupled in the following month, and it only rose in the waning months of the war. Perhaps anticipating that he would be answering for his crimes, on March 1st, 1945, he filed a report asking for help and resources, stating that of the 42,000 inmates in his camp, 250 to 300 of them died each day from typhus, and he warned that with the ever-increasing numbers being transferred to his custody, that the toll would only rise. Some have suspected that this report was him laying the groundwork for his defense at his inevitable trial after the war ended, hoping to explain away the deaths as those from disease. While it's true that disease did run rampant in the camp, like it did in all concentration camps, his figures ignore the numbers who died from his program of starvation and violence. That month alone, when he filed his morbid report, over 18,000 people had died in Belsen. Also relocating to Belsen that month was Irma Gräser. It felt that it was not safe for a female Nazi to remain at Auschwitz as the Soviets closed in. Gräser's cruelty towards inmates, reportedly, if it can be believed, became even worse in the environment at Belsen that Kramer had created. There she was known to make prisoners stand or kneel in snow, ice and rain for hours at a time, sometimes having to carry heavy rocks above their heads as they did so. If someone found themselves unable to carry out this task, she would beat the prisoner with a rubber truncheon until they were unconscious. In one of her most notorious incidents, she set a trap for the starving prisoners by leaving some potato peelings laying around. Two sisters, consumed by an insatiable hunger, tried to eat them, only to find Gräser appearing and punishing them by knocking their heads violently together. What makes this incident so especially cruel is that it took place just hours before the British troops arrived. By his own admission, Kramer spent the end of March destroying the meticulous records that had been kept at the camp, after he learned that given the current military situation and the size of the population he was now responsible for at Bergen-Belsen, they could not possibly be evacuated as the front line neared. Given what history knows about them, one can only wonder what additional horrors those documents contained. On April 12, 1945, with the British 11th Armoured Division closing in, two German army emissaries were dispatched under a flag of truce to negotiate with British forces. They told the British that the camp was now under the command of the Wehrmacht and not the SS, and that their main responsibility was to contain an outbreak of typhus that was savaging the camp's population. During these negotiations, the German army emissaries explained that they would be willing to apprehend the SS administrative staff and hand them over, something one British officer present at the negotiations noted that they seemed almost eager to do. With permission from the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, Kramer prepared to surrender his camp. British Army Captain Dick Williams was invited to survey the facility and meet Kramer before the bulk of the 11th Armoured moved in. When he returned, the visibly shaken officer demanded that an immediate effort be made to deliver as much food and medical assistance as possible, as it was going to be needed. The 11th Armoured entered on the 15th, and the scale of the horrors that went on there could start to be catalogued. A British Army officer later testified that one of the women's huts had space for 83 soldiers to live in, given British Army standards of the day. And yet he and his men removed 1,426 women from the very same space, the dead at times being indistinguishable from the living. With that in mind, it becomes understandable when on one occasion, British troops were shocked and horrified to find a young girl who they believed to be dead begin to make very small movements after having been placed amongst a group of bodies earmarked for cremation. She had so wasted away by that time that she was literally on the edge of life and death. This also left them wondering the awful question if any of those already cremated were still alive, if only just. In one part of the camp, as many as 10,000 people were crammed into a space without a single working toilet. In one final cruel twist of the tale of the man who would become known as the Beast of Belsen, deaths continued for weeks after the liberation, despite the best efforts of their liberators. Between the British entering the camp and the end of June 1945, as many as 14,000 former inmates perished, with them simply being beyond the help of anyone. In order to help the effort of burying the bodies, The former guards, who were now themselves prisoners of the Allies, were put to work as William Fry explained, quote, "I saw SS men and women, once the torturing, brutal guards of this purgatory beyond imagination, put to labour, loading the bodies of the people they had killed onto trucks. I saw them at the pits, unloading these human carcasses, dragging them through the sand and dumping them into a great hole, half filled with dead. I saw these dead long beyond rigor mortis, tumble limply into the vast common grave that hid their namelessness forever." End quote. Kramer and 44 others, including Irma Grieser, were quickly put on trial, charged under British military legal practices. The trial was held at Lüneburg, some 40 miles from the camp, and took place between September 17th and November 17th. The trial was not without its controversy, since the British officers presiding over the trial broke with convention by allowing sworn affidavits to be read out in court as evidence, instead of witnesses taking the stand to testify. This being controversial since the witnesses could not be cross-examined by the defense. The British courts deemed this necessary, as many of those liberated from the camp on April 15th were no longer in Germany, or in many cases had since succumbed to their mistreatment. Kramer was found guilty, and there could only be one sentence for such heinous crimes. On December 11th, 1945, an aircraft landed at Buckeberg from Britain with a special passenger on board, one Albert Pierpoint, who history now remembers as Britain's last hangman. Assisted by Regimental Sergeant Major Richard O'Neill, he set about making the preparations for Kramer's execution, building a gallows at Hamlin Prison. On December 13th, a noose on the end of a length of rope, tailored to Pierpoint's exact specifications for Kramer's size and weight, was placed around his neck. As Pierpoint pulled the lever, the trapdoor beneath Kramer gave way, the noose tightened, and the beast of Belsen was no more. He was one of the 13 executed by Pierpoint that day.